Hello and welcome back, dear listeners. This is the Silent Storyteller, and before we begin tonight's tale, let me remind you, if you enjoy these bedtime stories, please don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Every word of support helps this little corner of storytelling stay alive, and it means the world to me. Now, let's sink into the silence of the night and drift together into another story. The last train out of Chicago that winter night. It was the evening of January 14th, 1985, one of the coldest winters Chicago had seen in years. The streets were coated in ice, the kind that crackled under every footstep, and the wind whipped off Lake Michigan like knives against the skin. Union Station stood there, its great arches echoing the sounds of boots and hurried voices, each belonging to someone desperate to escape the city before the storm worsened. Among the crowd was a man named Richard Holloway, a 37-year-old journalist from Manchester who had been working in the United States for nearly a decade. His assignment in Chicago had ended abruptly after the Tribune canceled his column, and though he wouldn't admit it to anyone, he felt more lost than relieved. His suitcase was half broken, the leather handle cracking from the cold, and in his overcoat pocket lay a return ticket. One of the last seats on the train bound for New York that night. The station's announcement boards flickered, snowstorms outside interfering with the signals, and the voice over the tannoy came in broken bursts. Track 11 departure delayed, please wait. People groaned, some cursed under their breath, while others simply pulled their scarves tighter and leaned against the iron columns, their faces pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. Richard bought himself a lukewarm coffee from a stand that smelled faintly of burnt sugar, then sat on a wooden bench where frost had crept along the edges of the window behind him. He could see his own reflection in the glass, dim and tired, layered with the movement of strangers on the other side. The train was supposed to leave at 10:30 p.m., but now, even that was uncertain. At 10:17, just as the board stuttered again, a woman sat down beside him. She had auburn hair tucked into a woolen hat, her cheeks flushed from the wind, and in her arm she carried a small suitcase, the kind that looked far too light for a long journey. She offered him a faint smile, as though both of them were caught in the same unspoken question. Would the train even leave tonight, or would they all be stranded in the city that seemed to freeze harder with every passing hour? "Is this your first time leaving Chicago?" she asked, her accent distinctly British, softer than his but still familiar. Richard turned, a little surprised. "Manchester," he replied simply. "And you?" "Bristol," she said, tightening her grip on the suitcase. "I've been here 5 months. I thought I'd stay longer, but things didn't go quite as planned." There was a pause, the kind that felt almost intentional, as if both of them were weighing whether to ask the other more. Around them, the station buzzed with restless energy. Porters dragging carts, families huddling together, the occasional whistle echoing down the long, tiled corridors. Outside, the snow slapped against the great glass roof, threatening to bury the tracks before the night was done. When the tannoy finally crackled again, it spoke words that made half the passengers rise in nervous anticipation. "The last train to New York, boarding, track 11. Richard stood, his coffee long gone cold, and felt the weight of both relief and unease. Something in the woman's eyes told him their meeting was no accident. Though neither of them knew yet what would unfold once the train doors closed and the city lights faded into darkness. The night air bit through Richard's coat as he followed the stream of passengers toward track 11. The station's wide doors opened with a metallic groan, letting in a blast of icy wind that swept through the crowd. The platform was covered in a thin sheet of snow, the lamps along the tracks casting pale yellow light that seemed too fragile to withstand the storm. The train itself stood like a steel beast in the darkness, its windows glowing faintly with warmth, smoke rising sluggishly from beneath it. The woman from Bristol walked just ahead of him, her suitcase clutched tightly to her chest. Richard found himself unconsciously matching her pace, as though some unseen thread had tethered them together the moment she had spoken to him. Around them, people hurried with stiff, awkward steps, their breaths rising like mist, their murmurs lost beneath the grinding hum of the engine. A conductor in a thick navy coat called out over the crowd, "Boarding now! Keep your tickets ready. This train is bound for New York. No more departures tonight." His voice carried authority, but also weariness, the kind born of endless nights spent herding desperate travelers onto late trains. Richard handed over his ticket and stepped inside, instantly enveloped by a rush of heat that fogged his glasses. The car smelled faintly of coal, damp wool, and old leather. The corridor was narrow, lined with compartments on one side and frosted windows on the other, through which the platform lights blurred into golden halos. He found his seat in one of the compartments, setting his suitcase beside him, the worn leather sagging against the wooden floor. Moments later, the woman appeared again. She hesitated at the doorway, then smiled faintly when she noticed the empty seat opposite him. Without a word, she slid the door shut behind her and settled down, placing her suitcase carefully beside her legs. For a while, silence filled the space, broken only by the muffled shouts outside and the occasional clatter of footsteps as passengers shuffled past. The train lurched suddenly, sending a ripple through the compartments. Outside, the platform slid away, swallowed by the storm, and the lights of Chicago blurred into streaks of gold and white. The wheels clanged over the tracks, steady and resolute, carrying them out of the city and into the frozen night. Richard leaned back, pulling his scarf loose. He studied the woman more carefully now. Her auburn hair was damp at the edges from melted snow, her eyes green-gray like sea glass, and though she sat with her back straight and composed, her hands betrayed her, clutching one another as though to keep them from trembling. "You never told me your name," he said quietly. She looked up, meeting his gaze. "Eleanor," she replied after a moment. "Eleanor Whitcomb." "Richard Holloway," he offered in return, though she already knew part of that from their earlier exchange. A thin smile touched her lips, then faded. She looked toward the window where nothing could be seen but endless sheets of snow. The rhythmic hum of the train filled the silence between them, punctuated by the occasional creak of the carriage as it shifted against the cold. For a long while, neither spoke. Richard pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket, flipping it open as if he might write something, though his pen never touched the page. Eleanor sat perfectly still, her gaze lost in the storm. It wasn't until an attendant passed through the corridor offering tea in chipped white cups that the spell broke. She accepted one, her fingers curling around the heat as if clinging to it. "Why Bristol to Chicago?" Richard asked finally, curiosity breaking his restraint. Her eyes flicked toward him, sharp and almost offensive, before softening again. "Work," she answered simply. Then after a pause, or at least it was supposed to be, a teaching job at a small school. But it never felt permanent. "Not really. And now, well, now I'm going back." He studied her carefully, sensing more beneath the words, though he didn't press. Instead, he sipped the tea, bitter and weak, and let the sound of the train lull him into a kind of uneasy calm. Hours slipped by in quiet fragments. The conductor made his rounds, checking tickets. The lamps inside the carriage dimmed slightly to coax weary passengers toward sleep, and the storm outside raged on, unseen but ever present. The train rattled through small towns whose lights glowed faintly in the distance, quickly swallowed by darkness again. It was sometime past midnight when the first disruption came. The train screeched suddenly, metal grinding against metal, throwing passengers forward in their seats. Cups rattled, suitcases tumbled, and startled voices filled the air. Richard braced himself against the seat, heart pounding, while Eleanor's suitcase slid onto the floor with a dull thud. The train slowed to a crawl, then came to a complete stop in the middle of nowhere. Outside, there was nothing but snow and shadow, the outlines of trees bending under the storm. For a moment, an eerie stillness settled over everything, broken only by the hiss of steam and the distant howl of the wind. Richard glanced at Eleanor. She was pale, her lips pressed tightly together, but she said nothing. From the corridor came the sound of hurried footsteps, the conductor's voice low but tense as he spoke to another crew member. Snatches of words carried through the thin door. Signal down. Can't proceed, might have to wait. Passengers began to murmur, some growing restless, others pulling blankets around their shoulders. The idea of being stranded in the wilderness, miles from the nearest town, in a storm like this, it pressed against everyone's nerves. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something feels wrong, doesn't it?" Richard nodded slowly, though he wasn't sure if she meant the stop itself or something else entirely. He watched her hands again, clenched so tightly that her knuckles had turned white, and wondered just what she carried in that light suitcase she never seemed willing to let go of. The minutes stretched into an hour. The lamps flickered once, dimmed, then steadied again. Somewhere down the train, a baby cried. The wind howled louder, as though determined to claw through the thin metal walls. And then, just as Richard began to think they might remain stuck there until dawn, the door to their compartment slid open. The conductor stood there, his face drawn and serious, his cap dusted with snow as though he had just returned from outside. "Sorry for the delay," he said, his voice measured. "There's been an incident on the tracks ahead. We'll have to wait here until it's cleared. Please remain calm and stay in your compartments." He didn't elaborate, but the tightness in his expression told Richard more than words ever could. Whatever lay ahead on those tracks, it wasn't merely snow blocking their way. Eleanor's eyes met his across the dim compartment. In that instant, Richard knew they were no longer just two strangers sharing a late train. Whatever was happening out there in the storm, they were now part of it, together. The silence that followed the conductor's words weighed heavier than the storm outside. Richard sat back slowly, eyes fixed on the sliding door that had just closed again. His mind turned over the phrase, "an incident on the tracks." It was vague enough to be harmless, yet sharp enough to leave a lingering unease. Eleanor broke the stillness first. She leaned forward, her voice low. "What do you think he meant by that?" Richard shook his head. "Could be anything. Fallen tree, broken line, maybe a freight train derailed ahead of us. These things happen." But even as he spoke, he knew the tone of the conductor's face wasn't one of routine delay. It had been something closer to dread. The train creaked and shuddered in the cold, the heat inside becoming patchy. Warm near the vents, icy in the corners. Passengers stirred beyond the compartment walls, coughing, muttering, the faint hiss of someone striking a match to light a cigarette. The baby down the carriage had quieted, replaced by the murmur of a mother humming softly, trying to rock her child into uneasy slumber. Richard pulled his notebook out again, this time writing in the dim light. Words scrawled unevenly as the train shifted against the wind. He wasn't sure why he wrote. Perhaps habit, perhaps an attempt to anchor himself against the growing sense that the night was about to stretch far longer than anyone intended. Eleanor watched him quietly. The steam from her cup of tea long faded into the air. She had not once let go of her suitcase. Even now, her gloved hand rested atop it, fingers flexing unconsciously as though testing its weight. "Do you always write at times like this?" she asked suddenly. He glanced up, offering a faint smile. "Old habit. Words help me make sense of things, even when I don't have the full story." A flicker crossed her expression, something like recognition, or perhaps hesitation. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, turning her gaze toward the frosted window. Outside, the snow was relentless. The train lamps cast only a short halo before being swallowed whole by the storm. Beyond that circle of light, everything was shadows and white void. And then, just for a moment, Richard thought he saw movement out there. A figure. He blinked, leaned closer to the glass. Nothing, only the snow rushing sideways, thick enough to veil anything beyond a few feet. But his heartbeat quickened. Minutes dragged into another hour. The conductor had not returned. Passengers grew restless. Two men in heavy coats stomped down the corridor, demanding answers, but they came back shaking their heads, muttering that the crew refused to give details. Someone speculated about a frozen switch on the tracks. Another swore he'd overheard mention of an abandoned car lying across the line. By 2 in the morning, unease had hardened into fear. The lamps inside the train flickered again, dimmed for longer this time, then surged weakly back to life. Eleanor shifted uneasily, her suitcase pressed tighter against her legs. Richard could feel the air in the compartment grow colder by degrees. He finally spoke again, breaking the fragile quiet. "You've been holding that case all night. May I ask what's in it?" Eleanor froze, her knuckles tightening around the handle. For a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, with a careful breath, she said, "Papers. Letters. Some photographs." Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of something else, fear or guilt. Richard didn't press, though the question itched at the back of his mind. Instead, he leaned back against the seat, closing his notebook. But before he could speak again, the train gave a sudden lurch. Not forward, backward. The jolt sent a shiver through the entire carriage. A man's voice shouted in alarm down the corridor. The wheels screeched against the frozen tracks, metal grinding loud enough to rattle teeth. Then, silence again. Eleanor's hand found Richard's without hesitation. It startled him, the warmth of her grip against the cold air. But he didn't pull away. The sliding door cracked open once more. This time it was not the conductor but a porter, younger, his face pale with fear. He looked at both of them briefly before moving on, muttering under his breath, "Stay in your compartments. Don't go to the windows." The warning settled like ice between them. "Don't go to the windows." Richard and Eleanor exchanged a glance. Neither spoke, but both felt the same chill crawl along their spines. Time stretched again. 3 o'clock approached. Some passengers managed restless sleep, but most lay awake, whispering in the dim light. The baby cried again, softer this time, as though even it sensed the strangeness beyond the steel walls. Finally, unable to resist, Richard leaned once more toward the glass. Frost veiled most of the outside, but he wiped a small circle with his sleeve. His breath fogged it almost instantly. Still there, movement again, a dark outline against the snow. Too far to be clear, too close to be dismissed. It did not move like a tree swaying or a shadow falling. It moved with purpose. He jerked back, heart pounding. Eleanor watched him, her voice trembling for the first time. "You saw something, didn't you?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." The suitcase shifted in her lap as she pulled it closer. Her voice dropped to a whisper, almost swallowed by the hum of the train. Then it started again. Richard stared at her, confused, but before he could speak, the lamps flickered once more, this time plunging the entire carriage into darkness. Gasps echoed through the corridor. Somewhere, glass shattered. The sound of hurried footsteps pounded overhead, on the roof of the train, impossibly heavy in the storm. Eleanor's grip on his hand tightened to pain. The night had truly begun. The lamps flickered once, twice, and then the train was swallowed whole by darkness. A collective gasp rippled through the carriages. Somewhere, glass broke, sharp, sudden, followed by the startled cry of a woman. Richard's breath caught as the blackness pressed in around them, thick and absolute, the kind of dark that made even the closest objects feel distant. The steady hum of the train's heating system faded, replaced only by the low whistle of wind forcing its way through unseen cracks in the walls. For the first time since boarding, the warmth began to vanish, replaced by a creeping chill that settled into bones and breath. Eleanor's grip on his hand tightened until her knuckles dug into his skin. He didn't try to pull away. Her suitcase rested on her lap like a shield, and though he couldn't see her face clearly, he felt her tension. Her breathing shallow and uneven, her entire body poised as though waiting for something she had feared all along. Then came the sound. It started above them, footsteps heavy, deliberate, pressing down against the roof of the carriage. Slow at first, each one distinct. The sound moved along the train with terrible patience, crossing car after car. People muttered, some cried out in alarm, others banged on compartment doors, demanding to know what was happening. The footsteps stopped directly above their compartment. Richard felt every muscle in his body tense. The silence that followed was unbearable, stretched taut as though the very air held its breath. And then, 3 sharp knocks against the ceiling. Not random, not the groaning of ice, but deliberate. Eleanor flinched violently, clutching her suitcase closer. Richard whispered, "What do you know about this?" She shook her head, but her whisper trembled with guilt. "It's not supposed to follow me. Not here. Not across an ocean." Her words left him stunned. He wanted to demand an explanation, but before he could, the train shuddered again. The engine roared briefly to life. The lamps flickered weakly, and for a heartbeat everything seemed as though it might return to normal. The passengers murmured in hope. Then, just as suddenly, the lights died once more, plunging them back into cold and dark. Outside the window, Richard thought he saw the faint outline of a face against the frost. Too pale, too still. Watching, he pulled back instantly, heart pounding. The urge to wipe the glass, to see more clearly, fought against the instinct to stay hidden. A cry erupted 2 compartments down. A man shouted in panic, followed by the sound of doors sliding open and people rushing into the corridor. Their footsteps pounded past Richard's door, desperate, disorganized. In the pitch dark, chaos spread. Richard turned to Eleanor, speaking quickly, his voice low. "You know something about this. Tell me now, before it reaches us." Her lips parted, trembling. But before she could form words, the compartment door slid open. A streak of pale lantern light from the corridor cut into the blackness, blinding in its contrast. The conductor stood there, his uniform disheveled, his face drawn tight. He held a storm lantern that hissed faintly with gas. His voice shook despite his effort to remain authoritative. "Stay calm," he said. "Do not leave your seats. The crew is investigating. We've had an obstruction on the line. Nothing more." But his eyes betrayed him, wide darting, unfocused. He wasn't telling the truth. Passengers behind him demanded answers, their voices overlapping, rising with fear. He turned sharply, shouting over them, "Back to your compartments. Now!" The door slid shut again, leaving Richard and Eleanor once more in the dim circle of the lantern's memory. The darkness seemed heavier after its brief retreat. Richard exhaled slowly. "Obstruction," he muttered. "That's what they're calling it." Eleanor's voice was barely audible. "It's not the tracks. It's me." Richard froze, staring at her silhouette. "What are you talking about?" Her hand brushed the suitcase, the sound of leather shifting in the dark. "I should have left it behind in Bristol. Burned it. But I didn't. I thought I could carry it with me, hide it, and the past wouldn't follow." Before he could ask more, another sound came. A scream from the far end of the carriage. High-pitched, desperate, cut off abruptly as though the air itself had swallowed it. Silence fell in its wake, deeper than before. Passengers whispered frantically, some banging on doors, others praying aloud in trembling voices. The baby cried again, louder now, its wails echoing down the corridor like a warning. Richard leaned closer to Eleanor. "What's in the case?" he pressed. Her breath shook. "Letters? Yes. Photographs? Yes. But more than that, pieces of something that should never have been disturbed. Something old. I thought it was only paper, but it wasn't. When I opened the box in the archives, the footsteps returned overhead, faster this time, as though circling the carriage." Eleanor's words broke off. She clutched the suitcase to her chest, her entire frame trembling. The door slammed open again. This time it wasn't the conductor. A man stumbled inside, face pale, coat torn at the shoulder. His eyes were wide with terror. "It's out there!" he shouted, voice cracking. "Something's on the tracks. It's not human!" Before anyone could respond, he bolted past them, shoving the door shut behind him, his footsteps pounding down the corridor. Richard's pulse hammered. He looked at Eleanor, who now seemed almost frozen, her gaze locked on the suitcase. "Whatever this is," he said, voice firm despite the fear, "we can't stay here waiting. If that thing is tied to what you've brought, we need to deal with it." Her eyes met his, shimmering with a mixture of guilt and fear. For the first time since meeting her, she looked utterly fragile, stripped of composure. "I didn't mean for this," she whispered. "I only wanted to bring it home." Another scream tore through the train, closer this time. The lamps flickered weakly, then died again, leaving only the sound of the storm outside and the pounding of footsteps above. And in that suffocating darkness, Richard realized they were no longer passengers stranded by weather. They were trapped, with something that had come aboard long before the snow had fallen. The screams faded into silence, as though swallowed whole by the storm. passengers huddled together in terror, whispering prayers, clutching each other's hands. The train had become less a carriage of steel and wood, and more a coffin of shadows, rattling in the grip of something unseen. Richard sat with Eleanor in their compartment, the suitcase lying between them like an unspoken confession. She finally undid the worn clasps with trembling fingers. The lid creaked open. Inside lay a bundle of letters, tied with fraying twine, their paper yellowed and brittle. Photographs followed, sepia images of men in uniforms, women in long dresses, streets and homes that no longer existed. But beneath them, half wrapped in cloth, lay something else, a fragment of carved stone, etched with symbols that seemed to shift even in the dim light. Richard felt the air change the moment it was revealed. The wind outside howled louder. The footsteps above moved again, faster, heavier, until dust drifted down from the ceiling. Eleanor's voice broke as she whispered. It was part of a grave marker, a site in Somerset. I never should have taken it. They said it was cursed, but I didn't believe them. Richard closed the case quickly, but the damage had already been done. The train shuddered violently, as though the very weight of the relic strained against its steel frame. Passengers screamed again, their voices rising into a frenzy. The conductor ran down the corridor shouting orders, though none of his words made sense anymore. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the train jolted forward. The engine roared back to life, lights flickered, and the wheels ground against the frozen tracks. The presence above them shifted, moving back, retreating into the storm. The passengers fell into stunned silence. Some wept, others simply stared, numb and broken by the night's horrors. Richard turned to Eleanor. She held the suitcase tightly closed, her face streaked with tears. It won't stop, she whispered. Not until it's returned. He placed a hand over hers, steady and certain. Then we'll return it. Together. Outside the window, the first faint glow of dawn began to push against the storm. Chicago was long behind them, but the weight of the night remained, etched into every soul on that train. And though the engine pressed onward toward New York, every passenger knew the truth. They had not escaped. They had only been spared for now. The last train out of Chicago that winter night would be remembered not for its destination, but for the shadows that had ridden with it. Shadows that still waited patient for the day the stolen past was set right again.